sorry. Calling the special council meeting of November 12th to order. Adoption of the agenda, Councillor Lonsdale. Any additions? Ready for the question, those in favor? Carried. Is Bill unmuted? Or Councillor Elliott?
Do you want me to say aye, Mr. Mayor, or do you want me to go to the reaction icon?
Just say aye if you don't mind, please. We've only
That's
got
fine.
just one thing on the agenda right now, so it should be fairly simple.
Thank you.
Yep. Item 3, we've got administration presenting on finalizing the lease for the trailers. Mr. Edgington, are you speaking to that today?
I am.
Thank you.
Good morning, Council. As you folks know, this past Monday, November 8th, administration provided an update on the work completed to date in regard to the proposed winter emergency shelter encampment. Just for record, I think I'd like to read the motion from September 13th that originally directed us. So it reads that move that City Council direct the Winter Shelter Subcommittee to set up a fenced encampment on 37th A Avenue on the road allowance as a temporary warming shelter 24/7 until March 31st, 2022. It would provide security with cultural sensitivity training, first aid training, Narcan training, and cleaning services provided based on funding allocations being awarded to the city and or Wetaskiwin FCSS. So administration, as noted on Monday, we have currently identified a trailer encampment solution that would meet the operational requirements of a proposed winter emergency shelter. And while fencing is still being explored, it is not included in our estimate today, as we are seeking a labor-only solution, and we may have some pieces such as jersey barriers and other pieces that we're able to repurpose internally. So speaking to the purchase of the trailers, currently administration has received $150,000 of capital funding as part of the Reaching Homes federal funding grant provided through the Rural Development Network. The proposed trailer solution is currently over budget, and administration requires an additional $35,000 for a total of $185,000 worth of funding to be able to sign a contract to procure the trailer encampment and get the camp up and running. The total funding would allow administration to procure the leased trailers, as well as the utilities required, such as the generator, rental for electricity, and propane heater for tanks, or propane heater tanks, to get the encampment up and running. If council approves the funding, administration can sign a contract to procure the solution, which would then start the countdown on the 10 business days to get a solution in place. If a contract is signed today, an encampment would not be operational until November 29th at the earliest. If the funding is not approved, the administration will continue to seek funding from other levels of government in order to procure the trailers, which would then push the opening date of the trailer encampment. In regards to operating the trailers, to date, administration has not received any funding from any levels of government to operate the trailers. Although we are aware of a proposed agreement, and I'll get into that in a second. Administration is estimating, not including the trailer rental and startup costs, which we've already provided above, that the operating costs could range between $20,000 to $50,000 per month until till the end of March 2022. The reason for that large range or that large spread at this point in time is that we need to make decisions on how we are going to get electrical to the encampment and what the level of service from a private security provider looks like, which will greatly impact the cost. Administration has reached out to Fortis to inquire about pulling in electrical from the light posts that are right next to the trailer encampment, proposed trailer encampment. We hope to get that operating cost down as much as possible. In regards to the potential agreement for operating dollars, administration is currently aware of a proposed agreement between the government of Alberta and a proposed shelter operator that would provide operational funding to keep the winter emergency shelter running until the end of March 2022. There is a risk, albeit low at this point in time, that the proposed shelter operator decides to not enter an agreement with the GOA. If the proposed shelter operator were not to enter into an agreement with the GOA, we would work with the GOA to determine next steps on how we would obtain operating funding. Currently, we do not have any operating funding commitment from any other order of government at this point in time. The primary barrier there comes down to we don't have a location. Once a trailer encampment were to be put in place, or once a location has been identified and approved by council for shelter use, then operating agreements are a conversation around operating funding would be, we would continue to have those. The administration will continue to pursue funding related to this project and endeavors to obtain additional grant funds or funding from other sources to minimize the overall fiscal impact to the municipality. Going back to the initial motion from September 13th is that council directed administration to do this, but that we were to receive all funding allocations being awarded to the city and or FCSS through grant funding. And we still continue to understand that and will endeavor to recover as much of the money through grant funding as we can. This concludes my report, and I can take any questions that council might have.
Sorry.
Mr. Mayor, I have.
Yeah, I'm just looking. Did you get the total amount that you're looking for?
So today we're looking for an additional $35,000 of additional funding, noting that we already have $150,000 procured through the Reaching Homes federal funding grant, which brings the total amount of funding, if we were to receive an additional 35 through motion this afternoon, to $185,000 total to work with.
You said that doesn't include the fencing?
That does not include the fencing at this point in time.
Go ahead, Councillor Elliott.
I'll wait for the motion, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Would you like to make the motion?
Yes, I will, but I can't read what the exact wording is. But I will move that the city provide an additional $35,000 in order to rent the trailers for warming shelter.
Moved by Councillor Elliott, and you can lead us off with questions.
Okay, through the mayor to Paul. Paul, who will be responsible for the maintenance of the trailers?
Through the mayor to Councillor Elliott, as noted before, we are hopeful that once a trailer solution is procured and is in place at the location of 37th A Avenue, that the agreement between the government of Alberta and the proposed shelter operator would come to fruition, and we would have that operating funding, in which case the maintenance of said trailers would come through that operating agreement. In the event that those dollars do not come through, administration understands that we still require an operating funding to come through before we could open the trailers. And so in regards to the maintenance aspect, if we get the trailers on site and we don't receive any further operational dollars, administration understands that more work would be required to open the doors to said shelter.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions. Who will insure the trailers and the site?
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Elliott. Currently, there are two different ways where we can insure these. First way is through the vendor itself. They've provided on each of the units that we would be renting, they've provided what it would cost to insure in case any damages were to happen, that you would be covered. The administration has also been working through our insurance provider to see if we can get a lower rate there. And if in the event that we were able to get that insurance from lower than the private vendor can provide, then we would look at insuring those internally.
Okay. Another question. Usually with the lease, you have to return something in the condition basically that it was sent out. Will we be responsible to do that as well when the lease is up at March 31st?
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Elliott. In the contract, proposed contract, it speaks a little bit to the cleanliness of the trailers as well as the condition itself. And so we'd be required to, before returning it, to ensure that the trailers have been returned to the cleanliness that we received them in, as well as if there are any damages, we would, if there are any significant damages, we would be very hopeful that our insurance would cover those costs.
Okay. And lastly, Mr. Mayor, through to Paul, what about security?
Through the mayor to Councillor Elliott, administration is, we currently do have private security contract at the existing encampment south of the Walmart that patrols that encampment as well as the businesses in the vicinity. So that contract has already been approved by council until the end of March 2022. It is our opinion that we need to see what happens between the government of Alberta and the proposed shelter operator before we determine what level of service is required for private security. So the example there is if a proposed shelter operator was to come in and run the shelter, there might be a different need for private security than if there was no shelter operator in place and we were depending upon private security to essentially staff the trailer. So the administration is, we haven't finalized those costs yet, but I did want to note that there already is approved funding in place to get us through until the end of March, just for patrols. And once we determine what is going to be happening with how we operate the encampment, administration will have a better understanding of the need for private security at that point in time.
And hopefully that would come from government grants?
Through the mayor to Councillor Elliott, yes, administration endeavors to try to get 100% of this funding covered through grants.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Councillor Elliott. Anyone else? Councillor Everly.
Through the mayor to Paul, is there any indication that we have with the RDN funding that it could be increased? Because when that was first put through, a number was set.
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Aberley. So we had received a letter of commitment for $150,000 worth of funding through the Rural Development Network. At this point in time, we haven't gone back to ask whether or not the funding could be increased. However, we, as this project unfolds and we better understand exactly what we are putting in place here to is in regards to location to support the vulnerable population, administration believes that perhaps that agreement as well as future agreements may come into place in that other levels of government are starting to see what's going on here and are more likely to invest.
Thank you.
Councillor Nielsen.
Thank you. Through the mayor to Paul. So I'd just like to be clear, as mentioned, the mayor asked the question about the $185,000, including fencing, and you indicated it was not. Do you have any idea what fencing costs would be?
Through the mayor to Councillor Nielsen. And so extrapolating from what we had proposed that it would cost to put fencing in and around the civic building, and noting that it was significantly less than what I think we would need an encampment. I think that number was around just under $15,000, and so we would have to at least double that. And so that would perhaps be upwards of $30,000. However, and as noted earlier, there are a number of materials that we have in place, such as jersey barriers and some additional fencing that we already have internally that we most likely can repurpose to at least help offset some of these costs.
Thank you. May I continue?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So I just want to be clear in terms of what potential additional city costs could be. So potentially the fence would be 35. Councillor Elliott talked about insuring the trailers. And do we have any kind of cost estimates on insurance for either through the vendor or the city's insurance provider?
Through the mayor to Councillor Nielsen. So in speaking with our insurance provider annually to get the units that would be coming here to the encampment to insure those for liability and damages. My understanding it's just over $400 a year. Just want to see if our General Manager of Corporate Services has any other additional information to share on that. Nope, he does not. So the $400 annually through the city's insurance provider is significantly less than I think it's upwards of the vendor. I won't get into the actual numbers, but it's more. So at this point in time, we'd be leaning towards the city insurance.
Thank you. And you mentioned that we already have security in place for patrols. How many security members would be on at any one time?
Currently, my understanding is that at any one time, they've got one, it's just one member that they're setting up for those patrols.
And in the event that we repurpose them, would we require more than one security person?
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Nielsen, it really depends. I think if we're going to go down the path of we don't believe that a proposed shelter operator is going to come in, we don't believe that the government is going to be able to fund the operating piece of this, then absolutely. I think that's the private security we'd be looking at a lot more hands-on in regards to the operation of that shelter, and that's a special piece that we'll have to reach out directly to a private security company to learn a little bit more about. But if a proposed shelter operator were to come into town and help us operate this, and the funding we're provided from the government of Alberta, I think that's more of a conversation that we have not yet had with that proposed shelter operator to determine what would they be looking for a private security company. We haven't had those conversations, and so at this point in time, administration is just noting the approved funding that is already there in the patrols that are currently in place, and that more work will be required as we get down the road to determine how we're going to operate this.
Thank you. You also mentioned operational costs, monthly operational costs being between 20 to 50,000, with the explanation of why the variance is there. And you indicated that likely that sum would be borne by GOA. Is that correct?
Yeah, through the mayor to Councillor Nielsen. So because we already have the existing private security contract in play, and because the operating costs like the running of the diesel generator or the pumping in the water and out the wastewater, those we will get those as or operational costs, and that would be on the government of Alberta and the shelter provider to pay those costs back. In the event that that doesn't come to fruition, then we would need to continue to look for that funding.
Thank you. And through the mayor again to Paul, you've indicated you've reached out to Fortis with regard to electrical access. Do we have any kind of anticipated cost of that, or would that come out of the 185,000 in terms of trailer rentals and infrastructure?
Through the mayor to Councillor Nielsen, we've put in a call with Fortis. So it's going to take a little while for them to come here and to take a look around and then give us an answer back. I would think that if Fortis comes to town, that the cost of operating it, if we're able to take electricity out of the light post, that the operating costs will drop significantly, close to the $20,000 mark. And if not, then we'll be running off diesel generators, which increases the cost because diesel gasoline is expensive. Sorry, I don't think I hit all of your question there.
Well, yeah, I think you did. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And my last question then is, you'd also mentioned, Paul, that in the event that the service provider, after we've established a trailer encampment with the things in place that we've talked about here, if the service provider says that's not adequate and turns us down, you mentioned the city would have to take on further steps. What were you thinking when you're talking about further steps?
Through the mayor to Councillor Nielsen. So in the event that the shelter provider does not come to operate a winter emergency shelter in Wetaskiwin, and the government of Alberta is unable to fund that shelter provider, I think administration, as have already been directed through council on September 13th, continue to look for funding to see if we can get any money for operating. And then if we were to receive funding, grant funding to operate a shelter, then at that point in time, we would have the funds in place to either delegate that responsibility to another agency here in town, or take on that responsibility ourselves, similar to what the city did in 2018, I believe, where we internally staffed a shelter with grant funds from the government of Alberta. And so as far as how it would get staffed if a shelter operator were not to come into town, I would like to think that we would be as creative as possible, and while understanding that our staff capacity is limited, so we would absolutely need to bring on additional staff, and we also don't have the subject matter expertise to run a shelter, and so delegating that responsibility to an agency that does is our preferred method.
If I may, one more. Thank you. So correct me if I'm wrong here. If the GOA is prepared to fund and support a provider, they must meet certain, I'm going to use the word qualifications to run an emergency shelter. In the event that the service provider that the GOA is currently working with turns down this contract, but still gives money to but the GO still gives money to the city to operate, we would be required to have a properly authorized provider then?
Through the mayor to Councillor Nielsen, there are no other authorized providers that we're aware of that have the capacity to come into Wetaskiwin at the moment. And so if the proposed shelter operator was unable to come into Wetaskiwin, then I think we're looking at a solution where we have community agencies, volunteers, and whatever staffing grant dollars can provide, helping operate that, similar to what's been done in previous years. Right? That's how the shelter in 2018 and 2019 were funded and operated.
So Paul, are you saying then that if the GOA can't procure a service provider, then their dollars dry up?
Through the mayor to Councillor Nielsen, and so in speaking with the government of Alberta, not only like about 30 minutes ago, if they're unable to procure a proposed shelter operator, then they're willing to continue to work with us to figure out what we do to ensure that we can open the doors to the encampment and move forward.
Thank you.
Councillor Aberley. Oh, sorry, Councillor Lonsdale and then Councillor Aberley.
Thank you, sir. Councillor Nielsen covered most of my questions. They're about fencing and electrical. But through the chair to Paul, since Monday, has there been any more news from the provider as to their intent?
Through the mayor to Councillor Lonsdale, Monday, I believe I classified the risk of low to medium, that they would not come to town. I've spoken with the provider at least once. I know the government of Alberta spoke with them just last night. I would categorize the risk currently as low instead of low to medium. So it's at this point in time, they are prepared to come into town. They are ramping up and they're doing everything on their end to be ready to come November 29th, first week of December. And that's the timing that I had provided to them just as Wednesday of this week.
Thank you. And I do believe you mentioned if the funding is approved, it would be about a 10-day turnaround.
Through the mayor to Councillor Lonsdale, that's the schedule. So once the contract is signed, it's 10 business days, 5 business days to get everything to site, another 5 business days to get it all put together and running. So 10 business days total.
Okay, thank you.
What I continue to struggle with is not only the negative press that the city continues to receive from outside agencies, from reporters, from people with opinions, but I think the one that bothers me the most is the criticism from AHS. And I don't know if I've said it enough times, but I'll add it one more time. The city doesn't have a minister of health. The city does not have a minister of housing. The city does not have a minister of mental health and addictions. And the longer the government holds out or isn't supporting the city of Wetaskiwin in our efforts to supply housing of any kind or a shelter to a population experiencing homelessness, is only furthering the problem. And I think the sooner the province understands that this is not a municipal mandate and we're doing absolutely everything that we can with the limited resources that we have, the better off we're going to be. So once we stop fighting back and forth with the government of Alberta on who's responsible for what, or that we're not providing enough to their standards, I don't disagree with them. But this is certainly not a municipal mandate. And the sooner they get to the table and make sure that the homeless and the vulnerable population are looked after, the better off we're all going to be. And I'll continue to say that every time that they come back with maybe we'll see and we'll do it the best that we can and we'll offer the supports where we can, until that changes to here's our support, here's our commitment, and here's the work we're going to do with your community and every community across the province that are experiencing this. I know we're not the only one. I've had great conversations or lengthy conversations with the mayor of Edson, and the pods that they had set up there seemed like that was going to be the solution to all their problems. And they're experiencing just as many issues as we are. The pods aren't the magic solution to end homelessness. So while we continue as an organization to find solutions for the vulnerable population without the full commitment of the government of Alberta, we're going to continue to keep spinning our wheels and not have an actual solution. So get on board. I'm extremely frustrated with the runaround that we get from an order of government whose mandate is to look after these things. Anything else? Councillor Nielsen.
Through the chair to the chair. I don't know if that's how it's supposed to. When you put the motion forward a number of meetings ago, you were quite insistent that proper fencing be put up. And we're looking at a cost of somewhere around $30,000 with the proviso that we can use other means like Jersey barriers and so on. Could you remind me, please,
Why that was part of my
the
motion?
issues that you were wrestling with regard to the fencing piece? Because I think that's critically important. We keep talking about safety to those people inside the encampment as well as those outside the encampment. So I think that's really an important part of this conversation.
Yeah, my persistence or my wanting to have the fencing set up at the warming shelter, whether it was downtown or in these trailers that we're hopefully going to be able to set up, is that it was more so for the safety of the vulnerable and those experiencing homelessness. They are a vulnerable population that are being preyed upon by gang members, outside community members, in a state where they are extremely vulnerable. And if we can separate the two somehow and not have drugs being brought in, alcohol, weapons, assaults that were occurring, I believe that's the municipality, especially, regardless of where the funding comes from, protecting and securing the vulnerable population. We saw that at the hub downtown where they were being preyed upon in terms of drugs, alcohol, assaults, gang members. And I think that if we can mitigate some of those issues, regardless of where the shelter is, it will prove that much better for those that are using or utilizing the warming shelter. It's not my intention was not to have it set up so that it was like a jail where it was holding them in, but instead keeping those who aren't using the shelter or needing the warming shelter out and away from the vulnerable population.
Thank you, and I totally concur with that, and that's why, first off, I asked the question, but secondly, the motion was talking about fencing, and in the report provided today, we were talking about Jersey barriers because of the potential cost. So if we really want to look after ensuring a safe site, then there's another 30,000 on top of the 35,000. And I have, and then whatever the Fortis bill is, I've got grave concerns that to do this thing right, we're talking about not 35,000, but 65,000 plus Fortis. And if we were to set up an encampment with the $35,000 and we haven't really provided the kind of security for the population that's using the facility, for the very things you've even talked about, Mr. Mayor, I've kind of got concerns whether we've really done justice to the project
Without the fencing, you're speaking?
without fencing.
Yeah. Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do share your frustration as well. Just an editorial comment, first of all, is just that instead of being criticized, maybe somebody should be looking at trying to help us. And it's my understanding that AHS gave money to Rock Soup for firewood, but then they don't give any money to the municipality. So that's very frustrating. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Paul. Paul, I just have a couple of questions about funding. Masquachese has not come on board at all with funding.
Through the mayor, through to Councillor Elliott. As noted, I think on my report on Monday, administration has formed a partnership with the Masquachese Cree Tribal Council, and we continue to meet weekly with those folks. There could be potentially grant funding available through those avenues. More work and research is required to determine what and how much funding might be available through those avenues, as well as what other funding may be available from other levels of government at this point in time. It is the opinion of this administrator that getting the trailers to site is extremely important to ensure that, it significantly increases the likelihood of obtaining future grant dollars once we have a trailer encampment on site.
Thank you. Has AHS offered any services to the city or to the vulnerable population?
Through the mayor to Councillor Elliott, the city administration continues to meet with Alberta Health Services weekly as well. They do have a plan that they are putting in place to offer medical supports to the vulnerable population. They've committed to providing an overview of that plan to city administration prior to actually implementing it, to ensure that we can remove as many of the barriers that may exist in the community and kind of proactively get ahead of some of the pushback that they might have, and ensure that our stakeholders are engaged to do that as well. And so I'm aware that they are putting plans in place for those types of supports, and we continue to meet with them weekly.
But currently we have no support from Masquachese Health or AHS, like right now.
Through the mayor to Councillor Elliott, administration is aware that Masquachese Mobile Health and Alberta Health Services are providing medical supports on site at the encampment. I would consider them an active partner at the table. And I believe that once a trailer encampment is put on site, and once we've answered the questions in regards to how we are going to operate this and who's coming in and all of those pieces, that we will be able to start having conversations in regards to more of the medical supports.
Thank you. Just two more things, Mr. Mayor, to Paul. With the security issue, is it possible to have an increased RCMP presence on site as well?
Through the mayor to Councillor Elliott, we can as noted on Monday, we can speak with the inspector on doing that. He has been very supportive of the encampment, as well as the existing encampment, as well as the proposed encampment. And if we need to increase members' presence on scene, I believe that is something that we could work with him on.
Thank you. I just thinking that with 10 new members supposedly coming to Wetaskiwin, that we should be able to get some support there. My last question is, we have 10 business days until something happens if this is passed. What do we do in the meantime with our vulnerable population?
Through the mayor to Councillor Elliott. So as you've noted already, Alberta Health Services has provided funding to the Rock Soup Greenhouse to provide firewood, water, essentially all of the pieces that that encampment requires to keep going given the drop in temperatures here. While the trailer solution and encampment wouldn't be able to open its doors for a minimum of 10 days, AHS is supporting the operations of that encampment to meet the minimum housing standard.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Paul.
Councillor Everly.
Thank you. Well, through the chair to all of us, I support 100% what my co-councillors have said about the concerns with how we're moving forward past this, because it is looking to the case that it might just not be the $35,000 that we may or may not be voting on. As Paul continues to say that whether or not we have a secure location is the primary barrier to more funding, I'm trying to hold on to that for myself. And then also, if none of this other funding comes through, then Paul, is there an out of this lease for the trailers? So if we're unable to secure funding to continue, is that $35,000 secure for those 4 months?
Through the mayor to Councillor Aberlay. And so before administration can procure any sort of solution, we have to have 100% of the funding committed to. And so that cost of $185,000, that's totally all in, including rental, right up until the end of March. And so, if we're a month into this and nothing's going, and we've got the trailer encampment there, I mean, there is a clause to the contract to kind of get out of it, but there's a couple of things. Is that the 185 is not paid for up front, right? It's from now until the end of March. There would be a clause to get out of the contract. I just, at this point in time, don't have that in front of me to be able to better understand the impact that would have. But we do want to note that the majority of the funding, so the 150 out of the 185, if this motion was to be approved, is coming from a grant right now. So it's while it is tax dollars, it's not necessarily going to impact the municipal tax rate.
I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Councillor Nielsen.
I'd like to amend the motion. I'm concerned that I may be changing the intent of the motion. So I would move the motion as it sits here, but finish the statement contingent upon $30,000 for fencing to be acquired from other partners.
So you're saying that we are only going to approve the funding of $35,000 if somebody else pays for the fencing?
Yes. And so I don't know that I don't know if the motion can be accepted.
It's an amendment. We'll vote on the amendment and then it'll either be part of the motion or we'll be back to the original motion.
So may I speak to the motion?
Yep.
Thank
To
you.
the amendment.
To the amendment,
Yep.
yes. The reason I state that is for the very frustration that's been expressed on numerous occasions. We've given up land, we've given up copious copious amounts of administrative time, staff time, to try and wrestle this issue to the ground. And our very early motion talked about the need for safety with regard to a fence. I know we've got and have had a number of partners at the table, perhaps ad nauseum. But no takers to really jump in. And I think for us to say, in addition to all the time and attention that have been given to this issue, and the fact that we would be passing a motion to add another $35,000 to ensure that the trailers are there, is a sign of commitment. And we're looking for a commitment from another partner to ensure that the setup is done properly. Thank you.
So I won't support the motion. We've been fighting for funding for months. We're long past our time to have the warming shelter set up, and we need to get it done. And if we don't, we're going to be waiting for, at the earliest days, if not weeks or longer, to find somebody else who's willing to come to the table for the additional funding. It would be, and believe me, I hate it just as much as anybody else, that we have to continue putting money into something that is very clearly a provincial issue. We have put in hundreds, if not thousands, of people hours from our staff. We've offered land for a few winters, used a city building. We've supported the issue and done everything that we possibly can municipally. And I don't feel like this is fair for it to keep coming back on us. But waiting to secure funding for something else while it's already the middle of November, to not have this done when we've got a solution basically 10 days away, I think just puts us further behind. And I don't think that the vulnerable population can wait for another agency to step up. I think that we continue to fight for funding, finding partners at the same time as we are making sure that the people experiencing homelessness have a warm place to be sooner than later. I'm extremely tired of having to fight tooth and nail to get funding and have partners at the table. For years, I've been listening to different organizations and orders of government tell us that, you know, in theory, they're behind us, we support you, you're doing great. And you hear crickets when it comes time to actually put pen to paper and secure funding. So step up or shut up. I'm done. Anything further to the amendment? Ready for the question? Those in favor? Opposed?
Aye.
Back to the original motion on the floor.
Question,
Yes.
Mr. Mayor?
Yep.
Just could you clarify what kind of fence is going up? Is it going to be a frost fence, a snow fence? What kind of fence are we going to put up that's actually going to protect people?
I think we had the construction fence, right? Is it 6-foot construction fence that we were looking at?
Yeah, through the mayor, to Councillor Elliott. We would envision the fence as being, yeah, as you said, construction fence, metal fence. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anything further? We're ready for the question. Those in favor?
Aye.
Carried unanimously. I know that administration has been fighting relentlessly for additional funding, and I'll continue to do the same. I'll reach out to the two organizations that were offering funding in August and put pressure there as well. And I'll also send a few emails to potential funders as well to try to get this supported. If media is going to take anything from any of this meeting, I'm extremely frustrated and disappointed in the lack of support from other agencies. And then to be able to criticize through the media what a poor job the city of Wetaskiwin is doing. Anything else? Look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Lonsdale, those in favor?
Aye.
Carried. Thank you very much.
I'll think